Chapter 21. More male than Hogan. Just when I thought things were getting good for the Hart Foundation, I was completely caught off guard when Dino Bravo, a big, bleached blonde wrestler from Montreal who was chummy with Pat Patterson, let slip to me and Jim that Vince and Pat were taking the belts off us at the next TV taping, which was only 7 days away. Dino seemed to enjoy the crushed look on our faces, even laughing at us because we didn't know. When I called Pat, he confirmed we'd be dropping the belts to a newly formed team called Strike Force, Rick Martel, and Tito Santana. I told Pat that we'd be more than happy to put them over, but I didn't think it was right that I had heard about it secondhand from Dino Bravo and with so little notice. Losing the belts meant we'd be making considerably less money. And so it went. We gave up the tag belts on October 27, 1987, in a short but feisty TV match with Martel and Santana taped in Syracuse. In those days, if you lost a belt in a match that hadn't aired yet, you continued to wrestle as champion at house shows until the title change was broadcast. So, for the next few weeks, that's what Jim and I did. Life on the road gets to you. This one night in Phoenix I was actually the last to leave the roadway and lounge, which is saying something, given the rough old wrestlers and heavyweight boozers, such as Andre, Harley, and Jim, who were my competition. As I was heading to my room, a plastered Princess Toma threw her arm around me in the lobby and offered her services. When I told her I had to get up early, she looked at me with pitying eyes and said, "I remember when the boys used to have fun." Fun? I picked up the house phone and called Tom. "I've got a real babe here, and I'm not kidding. What's your room number?" A few minutes later I knocked at his door, covering the peephole with my finger. The chain rattled and the door swung open. Toma was standing next to me, stark naked, wrapped in a sheet from my bed, which she threw off, exposing droopy tits that hung down to her belly button, as she let out a war cry. She then threw herself into the room on all fours saying, "Give it to me the hard way." "Oh fucking hell." Tom groaned. I closed the door on them, laughing all the way back to my room. I kept waiting for Tom to kick her out, but when she didn't come back to get her clothes I tucked them into a pillowcase and left them outside his room. Tom remarked to me the next morning that it didn't matter to him that Toma had spiderwebs on her fanny, and just like that I had my next blackboard drawing and caption. I still had my Saturday night's main event match with Randy Savage to look forward to, not that we got to do it our way. On the afternoon of November 11th, we met and worked out a great match, but less than an hour before showtime, Vince summoned us to his office. He wanted a completely different match tied to a TV storyline around me working Randy's ankle. When I explained that working Randy's ankle would limit his mobility and take the speed out of the match, Vince cut me off. "You're the great worker, figure it out." Randy and I lit into each other right off the bell, and even with the changes, it went great. At one point he catapulted me off the apron onto the floor and I spiked my heel into the cement, cracking the bone. I painfully worked around it. For visual effect I pulled his boot off and stomped and kicked his ankle, which hurt my foot more than it did his. Then I whacked Randy's leg on the ring post and heard it go bong. I didn't mean to, but I ended up giving him the same heel injury that I just sustained myself, one of my rare accidents. Randy never said a word about it, just kept working like the pro he was. Both of us in excruciating pain. Randy finally small packaged me when I tried to slam him from the ring apron for the victory. Vince congratulated us as we came through the curtain, and Randy gave me a pained hug before limping off with his arm over Liz. Vince kept coming up with new ideas to feed his wrestlers to the media and fan maw. On American Thanksgiving weekend 1987, he launched a new pay-per-view event called the Survivor Series. The taping of the first Survivor Series turned out to be Bundy's last day. He'd saved up enough money to go home. As a parting laugh I carefully drew Bundy on the blackboard, on all fours, violently gagging and puking up a pile of various shapes, sizes and colors of bitten-off penises. I wasn't sure what I was implying, but it broke up the locker room, with Bundy laughing the hardest. Never to be outdone, he labeled the penises with the names of all my brothers. Amazingly, he got them all right. Another friend gone. I worked hard in the Survivor Series and surprised myself by being pleased that I got raves in the Wrestling Observer newsletter for being the best performer. Dave Meltzer wrote, "Hart was fantastic." This was long before the internet, and the sheets were the way fans, and even promoters, got their info about the business. But I had a problem with anyone who wasn't in the business writing about it as if they knew what they were talking about. I've always maintained that the only way to really know who is a great worker and who isn't is to have wrestled him. My usual attitude was that Meltzer, and others, were making a living off other people's sweat and broken bones by exposing a business they really had no part of. But then I'd come home to find my mom reading the sheets with Stu. Promoters were so tight-lipped that the only way anyone in the business could learn anything about what was going on in other territories and sometimes even in their own territory, was from someone outside the business. That was the ultimate irony. Most wrestlers hated the sheets, but they were the first to flock around if someone brought one into the dressing room. I was looking forward to getting home for Christmas, but my last stop was another Command performance for Vince in Atlantic City, the Slammy Awards, Vince's high camp version of the Grammys. Worn out and weary, I dragged my suitcases through the lobby of the Caesars Palace Hotel, laden with toys I couldn't wait to take home to my kids. The night before the show there was a rehearsal. Under the guidance of a choreographer who'd been with the now defunct 1980s troupe the Solid Gold Dancers, all of us had to sing and dance, which clearly wasn't our forte. She wanted Jim and me to dance across the stage during Honky's performance of his theme song, but I offered that it might look better if Jim went to throw me and I reversed, sending him sliding across the stage on his knees. From there I could run and jump neatly over top of him, and together we'd come up snapping our fingers and coolly dance off stage. She loved it. From 9 to noon the next day, we did a rehearsal. Then we did the whole show without an audience in the afternoon, so if there were any screw-ups in front of the crowd they could edit them out. As a rib during the actual performance that evening, when I sent Jim sliding across the stage on his knees, I threw him as hard as I could, launching him like a giant, out-of-control pink tumbleweed. Jim ended up rocketing across the stage on his ass, trying as hard as he could to put the brakes on so he wouldn't crash on the tables down front. He came to a stop on the very edge of the stage, and then I realized I somehow had to jump over top of him with less than a foot to land on. Feeling a bit like an Olympic long jumper, I ran and jumped, my boot barely grazing the top of Jim's head. We came up smooth, snapping and dancing, and exited the stage. Dick Ebersol loved it. Then we changed into pale pink tuxedos and took our seats in the audience to watch the Emperor perform. Vince gave his all to a WWF created rock song called Stand Back, confidently gyrating his hips like Tom Jones. But the message of the lyrics he belted out, all about how no one could stop him as he headed for the top, wasn't lost on wrestlers who had rehearsed and then performed a show for him 3 times in the space of 24 hours, with no food or drink provided by the management. Was he singing about all the promoters he'd wiped out or the wrestlers he was wearing out? The Topper was the last number of the night, also written especially for Vince and the Pile Driver album that the Slammies were designed to promote. Vince had all the wrestlers assemble on the stage to sing If You Only Knew in unison, and there we were, actually singing about how our destiny belonged to Vince. To the best of my knowledge, no wrestler was ever paid 1 cent for anything having to do with the Slammies or the Pile Driver album. You'll be rich and famous in a far-out profession. That's what the fortune cookie said when I cracked it open at the end of a Chinese meal at Christmas. On January 1st, 1988, I lay in a cold, lonely room at the Knights Inn in Lansing, Michigan, listening to Mikhail Gorbachev on TV talking about perestroika and an end to the nuclear arms race and taking stock of 1987. I'd had a good showing at WrestleMania 3, with a payoff of US $15,000, only a disappointment when I thought about the fact that Vince had drawn that record crowd of 93,000 to the Silverdome. Jim and I had won and lost the World Tag Titles. Julie and I were still holding on to a fragile dream with the big house and our 3rd child on the way. I guess I had no right to complain, because not everyone in my family was doing so well. Smith, without Maria, was more bitter and miserable than ever. Dean's life now consisted of getting high and simply existing. He made it look like he earned his keep at Stu's by tinkering around on old Cadillacs and moving piles of bricks and debris from one end of the yard to the other for no apparent reason. Bruce and Ross lived and breathed for Stampede Wrestling, Ross taking no pay and living on what he earned as a schoolteacher. Wayne still refereed and served as a driver. I could never figure out why my parents never gave Wayne, who was so reliable, a larger role. I guess it was a case of the squeaky wheels getting all the grease. Not that any of their sacrifices and obsession made that much difference. Even the local Calgary fans now regarded the dying embers of Stampede Wrestling as small-time compared to the WWF. Owen was carrying the territory, having incredible matches with a round, heavy-set wrestler named Mike Shaw and that big old biker, Carl Moffat, who was now Jason the Terrible, wearing white coveralls and a hockey mask and wielding a chainsaw. Carl had actually turned out to be a decent worker but had become a juice freak, addicted to cutting himself every night. Stu had also attracted Chris Benoit out of Edmonton, who was like a carbon copy of Dynamite, but without the meanness, an ex-CFL linebacker named Flyin' Brian Pillman, and some great, but small, Japanese wrestlers, Hiroshi Hashi and Fumihiro Nikura, who went as the Viet Cong Express. Owen had also become a star in Japan and won the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Championship, the top singles title of New Japan, no small feat. My mom was constantly miserable because the so-called family fortune was still being blown on Stampede Wrestling and all their hangers-on. Whenever I showed up at the house with Julie, Jade, And Dallas, she kind of clung to me like I was a level-headed bastion of sanity. She and my dad would pull up chairs in the kitchen, lower the volume on the TV, and, if Stu put on the kettle for tea, they'd eagerly listen to my latest stories and news about the business. I'll never forget Stu watching a video of the Slammys at Christmas, laughing so hard at Vince's singing that he had tears in his eyes. He asked me over and over with a huge smirk on his face, "So Vince is actually out of the closet, is he?" Vince wasn't gay, but in Stu's world, only a gay man would have camped it up like Vince did. The schedule had become merciless, with double shots every weekend, a show in 2 different towns on Saturday and then again on Sunday. My life was a whirlwind of airports, second-rate hotels, gyms, and dressing rooms. It was slightly more tolerable because Hope was back from his vacation and the pay was better. Between him and Macho, we now had 2 top babyfaces for the build-up to WrestleMania 4. Every morning I'd feel all those head-snapping turnbuckles I'd now become famous for, and my knees were permanently stiff from jumping off the middle rope. Every day it took me 15 minutes in a hot shower to be able to make myself stand upright. I was always in pain. One day a shoulder, the next a knee, an ankle, a split lip, a real cut, a shiner, and always my aching back and what seemed to be a permanently hyperextended left elbow from being whipped into the ropes by incredibly strong men. Tom and so many others tossed a couple of Percocets into their mouths before every match, and all too frequently I'd begun to do the same. I hurt. After my matches the agents would happily give me a swat on the ass with a clipboard, saying, "Hell of a match." I'd return to the dressing room with the fans spit all over me, to the point where Tom would get violently ill at the sight of the goobers and throw up in the sink. Still, I loved the energy, the feeling of being totally spent, undressing in a puddle of my own sweat. The Bulldogs were suffering. Davey was the star now, and he was getting tired of doing everything Tom demanded of him in the ring and then babysitting Tom every night. It also got back to Davey that Tom openly complained that it was Davey's fault he'd injured his back in the first place. Perhaps as a distraction from their mutual discontent, Tom and Davey hit the gyms as hard as ever, but with 2 new workout partners, Warlord and the Ultimate Warrior, formerly the Dingo Warrior. Some of the WWF wrestlers now looked so freakish from steroids it appeared they might explode. The self-injected load of testosterone or God knows what in my butt cheeks made me think, long and hard, about why I stayed in the business. No one seems to know if Hunter S. Thompson actually wrote these lines often attributed to him. The TV business is a cruel and shallow money trench. A long plastic hallway where thieves and pimps run free and good men die like dogs. There's also a negative side. But in my opinion, the world of TV wrestling was in a dark closet at the end of that hallway. Survivor Series had been an overwhelming success, so Vince decided to go for a 3rd pay-per-view a year, dreaming up the Royal Rumble, to take place every January. It would be like a battle royal except that it would start with 2 wrestlers in the ring, and then someone else would come out to join them every 2 minutes. The winner would be the last man standing. The first one was timed to air the Sunday before the Super Bowl, when the NFL was off. I was chosen to be the first guy into the ring, and I wrestled for 36 minutes in an all-out effort to get Vince's attention, with the hope of landing a decent spot for WrestleMania 4. It didn't work. All I was offered was a spot in the 30-man Battle Royal. Early one morning in February, I was awakened by a call from Vince. He was interested in Bad News and asked me whether I thought he could do any business with him. He also said he wanted to try Owen out again, with the mask gimmick I'd suggested. As I cleared the sleep from my head, my immediate thought was to denounce Bad News, my old nemesis. But Ross had recently asked me whether there was any way that I could get News booked in the WWF because Owen was having the exact same problems with him that I used to have, being eaten alive and cut short on his comebacks. Also, News was overpriced, and they couldn't afford him anymore. So I praised him to Vince. As for Owen, Vince laid out some big plans, telling me he'd spare no expense. His art department would design Owen a costume with a cape, and he himself wanted to come up with some kind of high-flying name for Owen, featuring a bird or a rocket. I called Stu and cleared the way for Owen to come to the WWF. Then I called Bad News. He was shocked that it was me, of all people, calling to tell him that they wanted him in the WWF. Topeka TV on February 17th was Bad News's first day. They had big plans for him to be a top heel working against Hogan. I thought, good for him, just as long as he doesn't work with me. Coincidentally, that same day, the Cuban Assassin was finally set to have his long-awaited WWF tryout. It would be the biggest break of his long career, God knows. He'd earned it. They wanted to pair him up with Nikolai Volkov, billed from Moscow because he was a legit Cuban and his hard work would carry the team. When we passed Bad News out back by the ring trucks, Jim gleefully remarked to him, "It's great to have the old gang here. You, and now the Cuban." Bad News picked up a lead pipe and shouted, If that motherfucker's here, I'll kill him. It turned out that despite the fact that Cuban had been the best man at News's wedding, their wives had a falling out. Somehow News and Cuban, once the closest of friends, had now sworn to kill each other on sight. News took off and, seconds later, chased Cuban out of the building, swinging the lead pipe while Cuban slashed away at the air with his knife. Chief and a bunch of the agents broke it up, and then Vince summoned them both to his office. He fired Cuban before he'd even had a chance to step foot in the ring. He had bigger plans for News. So much for Cuban's break of a lifetime. I went home to celebrate Julie's birthday in March. Afterwards I was planning to take 3-year-old Dallas on his first big trip with Dad, to WrestleMania 4. As I stood in the kitchen, watching Julie pack Dallas's small suitcase, the phone rang. "Hitman, it's Vince. I wanted you to hear it from me first," he said. "Damned if I can figure it out, but we receive more mail here at the office for you than for any other wrestler in the company. I don't know if it's that greasy hair or what. So I'm turning you babyface." I was totally caught off guard. "You get even more mail than Hogan," Vince continued. "I'm going to split the foundation up. I'm going to give you that big push that you've deserved for so long." At WrestleMania 4, he explained Bad News and I would team up at the end of the Battle Royal to eliminate Junkyard Dog, but News would double-cross me and throw me out. When he was presented with a giant trophy, I'd attack him and smash the trophy to pieces. I asked how this would affect Jim. Vince chuckled and said, "1 angle per person. Jim will have to wait." He had said that I got more mail than Hogan. I just kept repeating that to myself in disbelief. I got garbage bags full of mail addressed to me at every TV taping, but I never imagined it was more than what Hulk got. The next day I carried a mesmerized Dallas off the plane in Philadelphia, rented a car and strapped him into his child's seat for the drive to Atlantic City. For the next 2 days, Dallas had the time of his life, playing with all his favorite wrestlers up close. All of his action figures had come to life. He recognized everybody instantly. Hogan was especially nice to him, as was Andre, who called him over with his booming voice. Dallas was awestruck as he approached the giant, who hoisted him up onto his knee. As the pay-per-view was about to start, I couldn't find Dallas anywhere. My heart jumped when I saw him 15 feet up, leaning over the edge of a scaffold. He had a big grin on his face as I took the steps 2 at a time, stretching to catch him by an ankle as he tried to scamper off on me. Thank God. Macho and Liz were nice enough to babysit while I dressed and went over the Battle Royal with Pat and the newly renamed Bad News Brown, who was now acting like my best friend. The Battle Royal went as planned, and when I broke the sturdy trophy into pieces, I got a rousing cheer and, just like that, became a babyface. In the main event, with a little help from Hogan, Macho Man won the World Heavyweight title. After the show I did my first solo interviews backstage. Until nearly 3 a.m. I was getting better at talking, and for the first time I made reference to having survived Stu's dungeon. Eventually I carried a conked-out Dallas in my arms, through the fans in the lobby and up to my room. On the way home my bag was bulging with Ghostbuster toys. On the stopover in Denver, I put Dallas on the phone with his mom, and he happily told her all about his big trip. After a few minutes he handed me back the phone. I didn't want to alarm Julie, so I never mentioned how he'd locked himself in the bathroom, let alone how he'd climbed the scaffold. When I hung up and turned around, Dallas was gone. I frantically searched everywhere for him. What if he'd gone into the ladies' room? Or got on a plane? I soon had gate agents searching too. Finally, way down in the distance on the moving walkway, I spotted him gliding toward me with a mischievous grin on his face, holding the hand of a smiling security guard. I was so relieved to see him I just smiled back. I don't know what wore me out more, Dallas or WrestleMania 4. As a babyface I found myself doing jobs for Bad News at the house shows almost every night. They were building him for Hogan. I wasn't happy being a babyface, especially a losing one. Some push. Bad News still had no psychology or charisma. One night after a long boring brawl at Madison Square Garden, Vince remarked to me, "Bret, you could have a great match with a broomstick." I replied, "It's hard when the broomstick is mopping the floor with you." He laughed, but I didn't. I just happened to be home on May 17th, when Julie delivered a beautiful 7-pound, 15-ounce baby girl. We named her Alexandra Sabina. With my heart full and empty at the same time, I boarded a plane the next morning. Back to work. On June 22nd at the TV tapings in Binghamton, New York, my solo career was suddenly over. Vince decided to reform the Hart Foundation as babyfaces, he said, because we were too good to keep apart. Yet we immediately started doing jobs for the Rougeaus, who had just turned heel. They even had Jimmy Hart as their manager now. All in all, I was just glad to be back with Jim. Noticeably missing after WrestleMania 4 was Harley Race, who'd ended up in emergency surgery having 1.5 feet of his intestine removed. And then he got served with divorce papers. Honky made a big mistake when he joked in the dressing room that Harley didn't have any guts anymore. Honky was one of those wrestlers who never had an ounce of real hardness in him. When one of the least tough disrespected a legendary tough guy like Harley, several of us took exception, and Dynamite got up and backhanded Honky right off his chair. Honky wept like a baby after that, pleading for forgiveness. With Harley gone, Tom needed a new drinking partner. He latched on to Jos Leduc, the French-Canadian lumberjack whom Vince renamed the Maniac. The moniker suited Jos perfectly. Every night for over a week, Tom and Jos drank and took dangerous amounts of pills. Jos was no stranger to pills, but Tom was also spiking his drinks. Still, it was Jos who carried Tom back to his room every night. When it came to taking pills, Jos wasn't human. Then Tom vowed that this would be the night that Jos went down. I sat and watched them drink. At one point Jos was slumped in his chair, halfway to La La Land, when Tom flattened his lit cigarette with his fingers and carefully set it atop Jos's big, bald head. When it started to burn, Jos sat up and the cigarette fell down the back of his shirt. Without saying a word, Jos flexed his back and squeezed the cigarette out on his chair, then staggered off to his room. This was all amusing to Tom, but the next day Jos was fired. The pills didn't bring him down. Tom did, in less than a week. On my 31st birthday, my mom in Georgia threw a surprise party for me up at Hart House. I looked around at the herd of grandkids. Tom, sporting a nice dress shirt, jokingly rolled his eyes at me as he joined in singing Happy Birthday. Numerous young wrestlers who worked for Stu were there, including Brian Pillman. He sang with a smirk and a rasp in his voice, a reminder of the esophageal cancer he'd overcome as a child. Dallas and Jade's eyes were big and bright, lit by the flickering candles on my cake. My mom was the only one who noticed that my eyes were wet when Dallas helped me blow out the candles. There was clapping and the tune of forks clinking on glasses. All eyes were on me. I think it was that night when I realized that some members of my family were waiting for me to trip and fall. I also had to face the fact that chances were that I would. The world was littered with wrestling tragedies. Bruce was despondent because Stu had finally sacked him as booker. Stu could no longer afford to tolerate Bruce's way of running the show. He replaced him with Keith, which meant Leslie was in charge too. I glanced over at Jim, who was his own worst enemy and a bad gambler in life. Money burned a hole in his pocket. The more money, the bigger the hole. He lived as if tomorrow was never going to come, spending lavishly on himself, buying custom-made jewelry, jet skis, fishing boats, and motorcycles. Ellie rarely saw a penny of it because, for reasons known only to him, he kept her and their kids on a strict allowance. Of all of us, when it came to finances, it was Tom who seemed to be in the best shape. He was the only one who'd paid off his house. Both he and Davy were beyond cheap on the road, but at home they lavished their wives with cars, fur coats, jewelry, and cash. It seemed like nobody worried about tomorrow except for me. The person I wanted to talk to at my party was Owen, because he'd be starting with the WWF in a few days, but Martha dragged him out of there early. Owen was about to join the rest of us young stallions, ever racing. The adventure was in not knowing where we were going. The danger was in not seeing that our destinies were not ours to control, no matter how hard and strong we ran. More deaths added to my sense of foreboding. On July 4th, while driving to a match in Gander, Newfoundland, Mike Kelly swerved to miss a moose and lost control of the van. It rolled, killing his brother Pat Kelly, Dave McKigney, and Adrian Adonis. Pat's brother Mike survived, though the crash badly injured his leg. I flew down to Bakersfield, California, for Adrian's funeral. His wife said to me he was so big nothing could ever hurt him. Now he's dead. Then Bruiser Brody was stabbed to death. I had always been grateful to Brody for bucking me up with some kind words during my first months on the road with the WWF, when Chief was riding me. The last time I'd seen him was during a chance meeting at the airport in Detroit. Andre rode on those airport trolley carts that zip around inside the terminals, so Jim and I hopped on. Coming around a corner, we ran into Brody, who laughed at the sight of us. My last memory of him was his wave and his smile. On July 17th, Brody had been called into a dressing room in Puerto Rico by the booker, Jose Gonzalez, who also wrestled under a mask as the Invader. Gonzalez, whom I remembered from my time in Puerto Rico as an easygoing guy, stabbed Brody with a butcher knife and left him to die on the dirty bathroom floor. Supposedly, Brody had been a bully to Gonzalez in the ring one time too many, and Gonzalez snapped. All the wrestlers were too scared to help Brody, so they sat there for over an hour while he died. No wrestlers would testify against Gonzalez because they were afraid that if they did they wouldn't live long enough to get off the island. Gonzalez used self-defense as an argument and was acquitted. This was one of the most horrible things that ever happened in the wrestling business. It's strange, but wrestlers often die in threes. On July 24th, I heard that J.R. Foley passed away. Lung cancer came and took him quickly, too quickly for me to even visit him one last time. Swing low, sweet chariot coming for to carry me home. J.R. was an indelible character who, despite his shortcomings, made the world a better place. At his funeral in Calgary, they played all his favorite songs from the van. I know he'd have been proud of the nice turnout at his service.